Allora, con questo intervento noi oggi guardiamo oltre i confini dell'Italia, oltre i confini dell'Europa e dell'Occidente e guardiamo all'Africa nell'era del digitale e dell'innovazione. Oggi l'Africa attraversa una rivoluzione ancora silenziosa apparentemente nel campo delle tecnologie digitali e dei media computazionali. Le conseguenze economiche di questa rivoluzione sono difficili da prevedere, però ci sono già effetti, conseguenze di tipo culturale, politico ed estetico che sono molto evidenti. In Africa, come altrove nel mondo, la vita dietro gli schermi è diventata un fatto dell'esistenza quotidiana, anche per i poveri, molti poveri nelle città. Centinaia di migliaia usano Twitter, sono su Facebook, su Instagram, mandano e ricevono messaggi e foto del livello dei centinaia ogni giorno. Quindi Achille Mbembe guarderà a questa trasformazione che non è solo un evento tecnologico di grande importanza, ma guarderà come questa trasformazione ha creato una nuova sensibilità estetica e culturale che molti hanno chiamato, e lui stesso chiama, Afropolitismo. L'Afropolitismo rappresenta una nuova forma di mondanità, è un nuovo modo africano di essere nel mondo, in cui il locale è plasmato da risorse simboliche globali, da immaginari di ampia circolazione. Il computer e il cellulare sono i principali vettori tecnologici dell'afropolitismo e questi sono diventati degli archivi portatili di conoscenze e dispositivi che hanno cambiato il modo in cui il nuovo soggetto africano parla, scrive, comunica, immagina, come si relaziona con gli altri e con il resto del mondo. E questo intervento valuterà la portata del nuovo intreccio tra umano e non umano, esplorerà anche i termini in cui avviene l'innovazione tra rifiuti da una parte e riparazione dall'altra. Achille Mbembe, il nostro ospite, è Research Professor in History and Politics all'Università di Johannesburg, è di origine camerunese, nato in Camerun e ha studiato in Francia un dottorato in storia alla Sorbona e uno in scienze politiche, sempre a Parigi. Ha insegnato in varie università americane, alla Columbia, in Pennsylvania, Duke University, Harvard. Dal 1996 al 2000 è stato direttore esecutivo del Consiglio per lo sviluppo della ricerca scientifica in Africa. Ha vinto numerosi premi, tra cui il premio Ernst Bloch, il premio Geschwister Scholl e Gerda Henkel quest'anno. Achille è anche membro dell'American Academy of Science. Le sue opere sono molte, molto famose nell'ambito degli studi postcoloniali, soprattutto degli studi postcoloniali che hanno un focus preciso sull'Africa. Ricordo della postcolonie, sulla postcolonia, on the postcolony, e Critique of Black Reason, che sono cifre fondanti del suo pensiero indipendente da una parte e della frontiera su cui si muove la filosofia e la teoria critica in Africa oggi. Al centro del suo lavoro oggi, in questo momento, è questa idea di Africa come laboratorio. È un continente visto come laboratorio per il futuro globale, oltre i consueti stereotipi legati al colonialismo, al razzismo e al capitalismo. Quindi è un pensiero di frontiera con cui ci confrontiamo oggi. Io sono molto felice di avere qui Achille Mbembe e lo invito a venire al podio a parlarci. Grazie, lo salutiamo.
First of all, I would like to thank the rector of this university for the invitation to attend this year's Open Innovation Days. And I'm grateful for Professor Annalisa Oboe for her very gracious introduction. I've known her for a long time, and we do very much benefit from the work she herself has done, especially in relation to Africa and its diasporas. What I would like to offer is a set of really broad reflections on two things. First of all, on the concept of innovation, and as it is might be approached from a region of the world which to many is not known for innovation. A region of the world which for many is known for immobilism, inertia, a kind of time that is cyclical and where not much apparently seems to change. So I will offer a set of broad remarks on that concept as seen from that part of the world. And second, I will make a set of comments on the silent revolution that is going on in Africa insofar as the use of new digital technologies is concerned. So while preparing for this lecture, I spoke to a friend of mine who is a technological designer in Johannesburg, and asked him what he thought about the idea of innovation. He studied at MIT, is very aware of what is going on in the world, and I was somewhat surprised when he told me straight ahead that for him, innovation, and I quote him, is nothing but a slogan. And I asked him why. So he went on to explain to me that, in fact, our times, this age we live in, our times are dominated by something he called the mania for innovation. And then he added, and I quote again, the mania for innovation is a disease which tends to disproportionately affect dystopian societies. I wasn't really expecting this from him. And I might not go as far as he did. But listening to him forced me somewhat to pause and ask, innovation, yes, but of what kind? We have to ask what kind of innovation, to what ends, who benefits. We might want to pause and reflect anew about what we really care about. And this requires that we go back to the question not only of means, but more importantly, of ends. So what I'm suggesting as a first remark is a critique of the concept of innovation, which puts at its center the question of ends, the question of finality, as opposed to the dominant view that is going on right now in which innovation is preoccupied almost exclusively with the question of means. Let me add quickly that to criticize the rhetoric of innovation is not identical to decrying innovation. To critique it doesn't mean that we are against innovation. Now, properly understood, the idea of innovation has always been, at least in the Western world, part of theories of time and theories of history. You see, the West, as opposed to other parts of the human world, has always been preoccupied with this question of time and history. The others have been too, but in many different ways. So, for instance, when we go back to the most recent past, we realize that in the Western world, theories of history, let's say history used to be understood as a supernatural process. Supernatural process in the sense that history was basically the result of the work of God. God ruled time, and history was akin to providence. And this was the dominant conception in the West from the Middle Ages until the 18th century. The idea that we are who we are because of divine providence. Now, most of this changed in the 18th century when theories of history became secular. And from the 18th century onwards, it was believed that all events in historical time could be explained by prior events in historical time. And this was when the idea of God's providence gave way to the idea of progress. The concept of God's providence was replaced by the concept of progress. In short, progress meant that human history was the history of human betterment. That, in fact, our history was one of constant amelioration, betterment of our conditions of life. Of course, this idea of progress had its critics, but it dominated the Western world between the Enlightenment and at least the First World War. After the First World War, not many people believed any longer in the idea of progress because they had seen what humans were capable of. Then came the 19th century, when the idea of progress was gradually abandoned and gave way to that of evolution, with all its consequences, of course, in terms of the classification of human beings in a ladder, the hierarchies that were drawn from such classifications, so-called scientific racism emerging precisely in the bosom of evolutionism, and so forth and so on. Then came the 20th century, when the idea of evolution was discarded to give way then to that of growth and innovation. So to some extent, the concept of innovation is a very recent concept. By the end of the 20th century, innovation itself was starting to be qualified. Many began to speak about disruptive innovation, which itself was a slight re-rendering of Schumpeter's concept of destructive creation. In any case, disruptive innovation as a way of talking about the present and the future. Now, as we enter the 21st century, disruptive innovation is more than ever presented as the model for the future. It is increasingly presented as the explanation for how change happens. You want change, it will take this form of disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation, if you want, is the new faith. It explains and it justifies. Then we shouldn't forget that this is a concept that originates, in fact, in the arena of business. It comes from the business world. I have nothing against business, I have to say immediately, but you will agree with me that business is not the sum total of everything. So the concept originated from the arena of business, and since then it has been applied to arenas whose values and goals are remote from the values and goals of business. In the arena of business, disruptive innovation has fundamentally to do with, if you want, the logic of the start-up. It has to do with the use of technology and various kinds of devices to offer cheaper alternatives to products sold by established players. That is what it means. It is about new startups disrupting existing industries, refusing to play by the established rules. It has to do, in short, with making new products, bringing them to the market. That's what disruptive innovation is all about. It has, if you want, to do with turning things into commodities and selling them for gain at an accelerated pace. Now, of course, we have to pause and ask whether the goal of human existence, the ultimate end of human existence, is really to live in a society where everything must be turned into a commodity and sold for gain. We need to ask, for instance, whether public schools, churches, public libraries, and other social institutions must be subjected to the same logic of disruptive innovation, or whether they can be considered as industries in the same sense as tech companies and manufacturers. By framing the question in that manner, I am suggesting once again that we don't lose sight of the question of finality and the question of the ends and the goals. Now, we can't do this if we keep adopting the language of markets and business and extending that language into every single realm of our lives. The language of ventures, of business models, of investment, which only privileges organizational and managerial knowledge. So, in a sense, innovation language must be decolonized. It must be freed from the colonization of every single sphere of life by the commodity. For it to make sense at all in places such as where some of us come from. But this is a very complicated task, to decolonize the language of innovation. It's complicated for a number of reasons. One of them is that the epoch is in search for deterministic models of human behavior and decision-making. And knowledge these days is reduced to basically an understanding of what lies behind people's decision-making, their responses to marketing. It is a conception of knowledge that claims to possess laws that can be discovered through the use of mathematics. That's why, for instance, many believe that the humanities are irrelevant. And that what we need to do is to imitate natural sciences, to mimic physics, and therefore decolonizing knowledge and innovation requires somewhere that we transcend that physics envy, which we find a lot in the discipline of economics, with its infatuation, as we speak, with linear programming, with statistical optimization, information theory, game theory, and a whole raft of techniques we keep importing precisely from abstract econometrics and simulation. So that's one set of observations, conceptual observations, I think we can bring to bear on this idea of innovation, which will be with us probably for a huge part of the century, and which is in need of serious critique. Now let me move to the second part of my remarks, and this has to do with what is going on in Africa, what I call Afro-computation. You see, when we go beyond the big veil that covers the continent, the veil of ignorance, the veil of indifference, willful ignorance, I mean, because if we really want to know, we have never had so much knowledge about Africa as we have today. So much knowledge that is available. A quantity of knowledge such that there shouldn't be anybody on earth who doesn't know. So when we go beyond the veil of willful ignorance and prejudice, what we see is that, in fact, Africa is going through a silent techno-computational revolution. Electronic and digital footprints are everywhere, including among the poor. People write blogs, and in fact, blog posts this is something for those of you who want to open new frontiers of studies in the humanities. This is one of them. Many resort to credit card transactions. The visual and auditory landscape is fast changing. In music, we are witnessing an endless recombination and remix and mash up of sounds and rhythms, the sampling and recombining of old and new material, a lot of it technological, cut up and collage practices extend well beyond music as such, as old and new creative practices keep generating useful content in almost every single domain of everyday life, in visual art, film, video, culinary arts, fashion, and of course, internet applications. So here, like everywhere else in the world, life behind screens is fast becoming a daily fact of existence. Furthermore, people are exposed to, are producing, and are absorbing more images than they ever had. There haven't never been so many images coming out of the continent or circulating in the continent or being consumed by Africans and being the object of countless forms of reinterpretation. People are also increasingly surrounded by all kinds of devices. Let's call them dream machines, ubiquitous technologies like cell phones, the web, videos and films. And connection to the internet is not simply a preoccupation for the middle class. It is increasingly in the interest of the urban poor to be connected to. And even before food, I live in Johannesburg, even before food, shelter, and access to electricity have been secured, the first thing the African urban poor strives for is a mobile phone, then television, and especially cable TV, and of course, internet. It follows that as boundaries of perception are being outstretched, because this is part of what is going on, more and more Africans are being projected from one temporal regime to another. If you want, time, of which we were talking about early on, now unfolds in multiple versions. In Chinese versions, in Indian Bollywood versions, in Nollywood versions, and in countless many others, Brazilian novellas, and so forth and so on. So the struggle to capture these protean shapes of time have hardly been documented. And yet, they are paving the way for what some of us call an Afropolitan aesthetic sensibility we still need to map and properly study. So part of what I'm saying is that our research, our knowledge, once again, is far behind what is actually going on. And we need to close that gap and map these transformations and interpret them in ways that benefit all of us. So let me just spend a little bit of time talking about the mobile phone, because not only is it the most talked about, and as such a prime example of the ongoing Afro-techno revolution, but it's also that the introduction of the mobile phone in the continent has been a technological event of considerable singularity. And you see, I'm using the concept of singularity rather than that of innovation for the reasons I highlighted early on. So 3 comments in this regard are necessary. First of all, the mobile phone in Africa is not simply an object of use. Of course, people use it. You use it, pick up your call and all of that. It helps you to fulfill certain functions. It has an instrumental function. But it's a bit more than that. It has become a portable storage. I don't know what the term is in English, but in West Africa we have something called le grenier. Le grenier, you find it in every single village, especially in the Sahelian region. It's like a storage. It's built outside of the main house. It's part of the compound, but it's an autonomous area that is understood as such. What is going on is that the cell phone, the mobile phone, has taken the function of the old concept of the grenier storage, but a storage of all kinds of knowledges, and a crucial device that has changed completely the way people speak, the way they act, the way they write, the way they communicate, the way they remember, the way they imagine who they are, how they relate to themselves, to others, and to the world at large. Okay, if we want, we can call it an innovation in that sense. A kind of total innovation that basically changes who these human individuals are. Second, along with the advent of other computational media, the introduction of the mobile phone has also been a major aesthetic and affect-laden event. In Africa, this device is not only a medium of communication, it is also a medium of self-stylization and self-singularization. People spend a lot of time with it. It is as if they wear it. It has become an extension of one's being, a container of lives it in turn shapes. You would be amazed at the ways in which people treat their phones, the way they take care of their phones is itself an indication of how they would like to be taken care of. That I would like to be taken care of the way my phone is taken care of. I would like to be treated like my cell phone, because the way the cell phone is treated is probably better than the way humans are treated. So you see the kind of mental inversion that is happening in the calculus, the relationship between people and things, people and objects. Third, and this from a philosophical point of view, the biggest impact of the mobile phone and of digital technologies more broadly has been at the level of the imaginary. the interaction between humans and screens has intensified, and with it, the experience of life, the experience of the world as cinema. That life is like cinema. Just as in other instances, life is understood as a lottery. When you play the lottery, you might lose, you might win, and you might win big. You might also lose really big. So life and the world as cinema, the cinematic nature of life and of human existence. I could go on and on, giving you a set of examples, including those in Kenya, for instance, where the mobile phone, the apps that are being produced are contributing to the production of material wealth. But that is known. I want to insist here on the rather philosophical dimensions, the way in which the whole imaginary architecture of African societies is changing and is pushing people into an entirely new temporality. So the argument, in fact, one can make, which is slightly different from a classical Afrofuturist argument, is that the plasticity of digital forms, because that is what is really at stake here, this plasticity of digital forms speaks powerfully to the plasticity of African pre-colonial cultures. Why is it that they espouse these digital forms with such eagerness and with such facility? Is because they speak, these digital plastic forms speak very powerfully to something that is already there in their cultural memory and which precedes the advent of these technologies. In fact, these new digital technologies speak once again powerfully to African ancient ways of working with representation, of working with mediation, of folding reality via objects. And they force us then, if we really want to articulate a powerful discourse on innovation, to pay serious attention to the historical cultural memories of these societies. Why is it that I'm saying this? I'm saying this because when you look at them, in fact, African pre-colonial cultures, they were obsessed by a number of things, a number of fundamental questions having to do with the relationship between means and ends, with which I started with. They were, for instance, these pre-colonial cultures, obsessed by the interrogation concerning the boundaries of life. Where is it that life starts? Where does it end? When do we know that it has ended? When you look at their myths, their oral literatures, their cosmogonies, some of the most important queries were those concerning the world beyond human perceptibility, the world beyond human visibility. What is it there beyond what we see? Is there any reality beyond what we actually see? Beyond what we actually are conscious of? And in that sense, the time of objects was not unlike the time of humans, because objects, contrary to Western traditions, were not at all seen as static entities. Rather, they were like flexible living beings endowed with original, and at times magical and even therapeutic properties. In other words, objects were believed to have an agency all of their own, which was totally autonomous from human agency. And therefore, if you wanted to live well, if you wanted to innovate, you wouldn't be able to innovate by subjugating the object to your will. Innovation rested on the capacity to negotiate with objects, to enter into transactions with object, mindful of its own power and the autonomy of its agency, which is totally different from the kinds of metaphysics we have in the West, where you have a subject confronting an object in a struggle in which one of the protagonists has to lose, or one of the protagonists has to be subjected to the will of the other. It's a different type of disposition, if you want. The other thing African pre-colonial cultures were obsessed with, I told you the first one was the world beyond what we see. They were also obsessed by the question of interfaces. The world of interfaces. Why? Because the world of interfaces served as the linchpin to transgress existing boundaries. Boundaries were made to be transgressed where they existed. With human beings and other living entities, let's say humans and other living entities entertained a relationship of reciprocal causation. And this is what early anthropologists mistook for animism. So if you want, the argument I'm trying to make is that in our context, I'm not saying in every context, but in our context, a proper reflection on innovation has to take seriously the idea of animism precisely as the starting point for a critique of the dystopian nature of current rhetoric on innovation. I can go on and on this. We'll probably have a few minutes for questions and answers. Let me just end then by making a few comments on innovation in the times of the Anthropocene. I don't believe that we can talk about innovation today as if humanity, the Earth in general, wasn't facing probably the biggest challenge it has ever faced in our short history, because the history of the humans is in fact a very short one in relation to the history of the Earth. And in that sense, Africa is, as Annalisa suggested, a planetary laboratory. It is a planetary laboratory of innovation in the times of the Anthropocene, which is a time when history itself is being recast not as the history of humans alone, or the history of humans first, but as an integrated history of the Earth system. Technical systems and the human world. I just told you that a technological revolution is taking shape here, which is not much talked about. It's taking shape at a time also when the continent is increasingly perceived as the last frontier of capitalism. And as you know, out of Africa, an incredible amount of wealth has been extracted over centuries. And this wealth has flowed out to almost every corner of the globe. There's not one corner of the globe that hasn't benefited through history from wealth extracted from the continent. To be sure, the continent's natural assets are in danger of being depleted. Waste and pollution have increased exponentially. But Africa remains the last territory on Earth that has not yet been entirely subjected to the rule of capital. It is the last repository of a vast body of untapped wealth, minerals in the underground, plants and animals, water and sun, all the forms of energy latent in the Earth's crust. Its biosphere is still more or less intact. Its hydrographic power, its solar energy, its territorial immensities are hardly touched. In fact, it is the last major chunk of our planet which has not yet been entirely connected to its many different parts. And this single gargantuan landmass can still support a huge number of people. It is the only place on Earth where people can still come and begin anew, and where the potential for the human and other species is still high. The times, therefore, are propitious for big questions concerning the relation of human life to planetary life in the context of geological recasting of historical time and therefore of innovation. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie molte, Achille Mbembe. It was a fantastic talk. And there's so many things that we could discuss, I think. We are running late, but I think we'll take at least 10 minutes because we started late. And so we have some time to go through and not digest, because there's so much to digest from what you said, but start thinking about it in depth. First of all, I appreciated this kind of historical overview that you gave of the idea of advancement, progress, and how it led to innovation and then disrupted innovation. This is part of the kind of history that we are embedded in the West, and that needs to be somehow taken on in order to understand what innovation means here, but also what innovation means in other parts of the world, namely Africa. And I don't know about you, but I was really interested in the way in which Achille connected contemporary innovation, the technological, and the pre-colonial cultures of Africa. I think that's a stunning kind of analysis. Honestly, the idea of how people related to objects and why. this, in a way, justifies the way in which something like a mobile phone has become, you know, not a fetish, but something like a supporting, an object supporting the life and changing the life of people. So I'm just trying to think whether this, for example, means that there's a huge Africa has jumped from colonial times and ways of relating to the West to an erasure of that kind of mode of relation by reconnecting through technology with a very ancient past. And does that mean also that, for example, literacy is an issue that is no longer at stake, or is it still on the table? And from an educational point of view, from a pedagogical point of view, is that being taken on with some kind of awareness in Africa? Or maybe this could be a brief question, sorry. And then we'll take questions from the floor if you think about it in the meantime. Thank you.
No, but
It's on.
no, I agree with the comments you made. That's exactly what I was trying to convey by revisiting very briefly the history of the concept and its various mutations where it originated, and trying to link it up with what seems to me to be the urgent interrogation our world must enact on questions of finality and cultural memory. And underlying all of that was, as you correctly pinned down, a preoccupation with the future. Where do we go from here? With what kinds of resources, whose function is to allow people to live the kind of existence they aspire to.
Unfortunately, we come, particularly here in Italy, we come from a culture in which Niccolò Machiavelli's thinking, you know, the end justifies the means, somehow is still very strong. Whereas I think we should really revise that in view of what you said. Are there any questions or comments? One here. Thank you.
First of all, let me congratulate you on this very clear and very impressive talk. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I was really impressed by exactly the same issue that Annalisa just pointed out, and by your statement that we should take animism seriously. And of course, this is a bit difficult for Europeans. I think we are somehow in trouble with that, but maybe not so much so. I was actually wondering whether you are in any way familiar or conversing with a French philosopher and anthropologist whose name is Bruno Latour, who's working on object-oriented ontology. Therefore, this kind of discourse on the agency of things is also going on quite powerfully in Europe and in other westernized areas. And I was actually wondering whether you find those ideas of any use, if they can be of use. And then I have another issue, which is talking about Africa as though there was one Africa, and I think there are 100,000 Africas, different Africas, and should we not be more aware when we use this term? I mean, we know that Europe is nothing. We have various parts of the continent, and I think maybe we should also take that more seriously. I mean, trying to be more specific. Or do you think we can really talk about Africa as though there was a general possibility for discoursing about it? That's it. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Did you want to answer? take another question here, and then...
Thank you. I'm actually personally interested in a slightly different concept and of the digital, and how do you think it plays a role in the diasporic movements and in the way it we could say contaminate, how the digital contaminate the local reality of Africa with the global, I would say. Thank you.
Okay. The first question on what is called the object-oriented turn in philosophy, anthropology, and all that. Look, I mean, if I were to be silly, I would just say welcome, welcome to where we have always been. Welcome to where we have always been, in the sense that anyone who has a slight understanding of African pre-colonial systems of thought, cosmologies, mythologies, religions, knows very well that the key starting point of any interrogation on the human has always been the question of relation, of relationality, as opposed to the question of ontology, which from Aristotle on has dominated Western metaphysics. Being in time, being in this, being in that, where ontology comes first. Whereas ontology comes first in the dominant traditions of Western metaphysics, relation comes first when it comes to African pre-colonial systems of thought. And some of the dualities, dichotomies without which the West cannot think. To think, Western metaphysics needs dualisms. Subject, object, nature, culture, men, women. There's always something opposite. It's not exactly the same everywhere else. So this question of relation has led in the continent to an understanding of life, history, and time, an understanding in which the human is not that exceptional. The human is not at all exceptional. The human is but part of a broader range of living entities. And in fact, for the world to last, the world the human inhabits to last and to prosper, the human has to interact and relate to other existing living beings in a way that is not necessarily confrontational. So we have here an entirely different cosmological perspective, which is very attuned to the kinds of times we live in, which is the time of a very serious crisis of the biosphere, and the ecological dimension being but one part of it, when questions of the end of life and human extinction are right in the cards. So in that sense, we just say, I mean, Latour and the others, welcome to the dinner. We have been there all along. They came and said, okay, this is animism. So now we are all animists. If we have not all been modern, maybe at least now we recognize that we are all animists. So that's the facetious answer if you want, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. As far as Africa is concerned, there are many ways in which we can talk about Africa, and we have to allow precisely for those many ways. Some look at it in terms of the recent inventions, nation state with the colonial boundaries, and so on and so on. That, I mean, of course, those localities are important, but some of us are interested in disenclaving the continent, including intellectually, including conceptually. We are interested in turning it into a vast space of circulation, both territorially and mentally. Because in fact, when we have conjugated in the plural all its ethnic communities, all its different nation states and so on and so on, one reality is clear. This has been an entity, a space, historically in motion. That's why Africa is everywhere. I mean, there's no part of the world that doesn't partake of its history because of the displacement of its people, diasporas everywhere. But also the world is in the continent. And it's that imbrication that some of us are trying to privilege in any reading of what's going on there. And as far as the diasporas are concerned, of course, the same developments I mentioned extend to the diaspora. Diasporas have found a renewed life thanks to these new digital technologies. Ideas going out and back. Major developments in the continent are in fact now propelled by those diasporas. There's a convergence between the old diasporas in the US, for instance, and the new ones in Europe, more and more in China and elsewhere. And what we are witnessing is really the birth of an entirely new reality.
Thank you. We need to close here. It was a fantastic time to share with Achille Mbembe. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and for coming here to Padova, and come again, please. Thank you.